Prime Minister has warned the insurance industry that the government will do whatever is needed to ensure that flood victims are paid their fair share. You might remember last year a parliamentary inquiry found that insurers still had unresolved claims more than 2 years after that flooding around Lismore and the Northern Rivers in 2022. And I've increasingly been coming to the view, Parnell, that it would seem insurance companies, plural, don't understand that what they are involved in is essentially a form of legal gambling where they're taking on the bet that you're not going to make a claim against them, but they want to make sure that the house will always win. and so they're setting it up essentially so it's impossible to get insurance if there is any likelihood that you might make a claim against your property. Well, if that's how you want to operate, perhaps the government should start intervening and saying that's not a fair bet for the consumer to get involved in.
Well, look, so I tend to think of insurance in the same way you do, as a gamble, as a bet. And yes, there are a lot of insurance policies where the terms and conditions are a bit tricky, and you've got to be careful of that. But we've also got to be careful
when we're talking about
when we're talking about Lismore and Brisbane and areas which have repeatedly had these floods. Right, this is not a one-off event there. These are regular events, and we know that Lismore is, for instance, many of the houses are built on a basin which floods regularly. We've known that for a very long time. And the problem that some of the insurance companies are having is this is no longer a bet. Like, if they had a choice not to bet on this, they would not. So what the government has done is stepped in and said, oh, well, you know, we'll do a sort of reinsurance pool, which hasn't made it much cheaper, but it can sometimes lower the perceived risk from the purchaser's perspective. So people keep on making these gambles, and then the Prime Minister steps in and says, oh, you can't betray them. But actually, really, they really just need to not be living there anymore. You know, these are not habitable places. So that's where I have some sympathy with the insurers. I have a lot of sympathy with the people who have these houses in the first place. A lot of the time, the people who aren't moving because they can't afford to, right? And that's where we need to say, okay, perhaps there's a role for the government to step in and say, okay, not only are we going to ensure that there is somewhere for you to go because there is a housing crisis, but we're going to ensure that you can be helped to afford to relocate to that place.
Well, it'd be nice if some of those 1.3 million houses or whatever it was, Kel, that we were told were going to be built in the next few years had come up, so they actually had somewhere to go. But yes, you can understand why the insurance company wouldn't want to take on what it sees to be not a potential claim, but a sure claim that is going to come through. But these people are stuck between a rock and a hard place. You have to feel sorry for them.
You do, but at the same time, I mean, Parnell's got a point. Local councils have got a lot to do with it. They decide to allow building on floodplains. There was a time, if you went to a country town, wherever the floodplain was near the river, were playing fields, were sporting fields, right? And they flooded and, you know, but Gunnedah, which I knew well many years ago, there was a floodplain, no houses there. There are now. At some point, the council said to the developers, yes, we'll take the money, that's all right, you can build there. So they've got to take some responsibility. And as Parnell said, you know, if it's a floodplain, it's a floodplain, it's going to flood. There are some things which are excluded from contracts, and this is not just an ordinary flood. This is Alfred. This is a cyclone. And sometimes you can get policies for your house that will cover you for flood and rain damage and fire, but not cyclones. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for the insurance industry. My feeling is very much the same as yours. They're like the person who makes the bet at the casino that it's going to land on red, and when it lands on red, the croupier says, well, it's reddish, but it's not reddish enough.
Exactly, and then they start saying it's an act of God, and therefore I have nothing to do with it. Please, Bronwyn Bishop, Claire, was talking to me the other day about the idea that you have basically a government disaster relief fund which operates in a similar
socialism.
in a similar manner to the Future Fund, where money is invested with the purpose that people who cannot get or are unable to get insurance for their property on the basis that it is in an area that is prone to natural disaster would essentially have their insurance secured by the federal government in a pool of money that is actually accumulating more money. It makes a bit of sense to me.
Unless it's a form of double dipping, like if I'm paying money to my insurer and then I'm also paying tax, then I'm paying twice, right? I should only be paying one time. I think, I'm critical of insurance companies. I think we all know people who have had legitimate claims that have been knocked back because for some reason they couldn't prove the property wasn't damaged before, some kind of natural disaster hit. And so there's all of these loopholes that these companies pursue to get out of making payments. And I think maybe there probably is legislation and regulation around the industry that just needs to be enforced a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah.
I think that, I've started to feel pretty sorry for the insurers myself after all this discussion. Then I realised they're a bunch of bastards. Look, firstly, no one puts a gun to anyone's head and says, you will be an insurer, right? This is a game that they have got into because they think they can make a buck out of it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm all for capitalism. Unlike Bronwyn Bishop, I'm all for the free market. And I don't mind the idea, actually, but for someone who's always railing against governments being involved in anything, it's strange. But you've got a situation, like in Lismore, right? I think something like, and I couldn't believe it when I read it, which is why it's stuck in my mind, something like 80% of the homes there do not have flood insurance because the premiums are so high, they simply cannot. They literally just cannot afford to.
Because it's not a bet anymore.
Because it's not a bet anymore, that's right, because insurers are just going, no, we won't insure. So they're basically just levying them out of the market, right? And so now these people, they're living in these houses, they already own these houses if they're insuring them. What are they supposed to do? Where are they supposed to go? They're not going to be able to sell them because they're uninsurable. They may have had them in the family for generations, so they may have inherited them. So this might be their only actual source of property and wealth. If these people leave their homes, where do they go? How do they pay for themselves? They're often elderly, as we know, in the community, or bongheads because it's Lismore and they just cannot, these guys are not going to be able to
It's a bit rough on the good people of Lismore.
2480. So I do feel a huge amount of sympathy. These are real salt of the earth people. These are poor people. They cannot afford to just pick up sticks and move. And it's completely unrealistic to say, well, they just shouldn't be living there in the first place. So I think the insurers do have to step up and find, if they are going to say, oh, but we're good corporate citizens, we're aliens. I mean, look at the premiums that are going up for everything else. Like I just look at my home and contents insurance, and I say, I don't have that much stuff. Like this is just thousands upon thousands of dollars. Even just car insurance, I must have paid, double the value of my actual car by now without having.
Tell me about.
Okay, these guys are not short of a quid. So if they're not able to cross-subsidise the massive profits they make in other areas into actually providing the help that they trade their brand on, then get out of business and do what Bronwyn says. Let the government take over.